The moment the doorbell rang for the 11th time that morning, I was standing in my own kitchen holding a folder that would end everything, and I felt strangely calm, the kind of calm that only comes after you've stopped hoping people will change and started preparing for who they actually are. Through the window, I could see 3 more cars pulling into my driveway, doors slamming, coolers and folding chairs being dragged across my lawn like it was a public park. And somewhere in that crowd was my son's wife, Renata, laughing loudly with her sister as if this house had always belonged to her family and not to the woman who raised the man she married. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a cruel person. I spent 31 years teaching high school English in a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina. And if you ask any former student, they'll tell you I was patient to a fault, the kind of teacher who gave second chances until there was nothing left to give a second chance to. But patience has a limit, and mine had been tested for exactly 2 years, ever since my son Caleb married a woman who treated kindness like weakness and treated my home like a resource to be extracted rather than a place to be respected. That Thanksgiving morning, as 43 people I had never invited unloaded folding tables from the back of a rented U-Haul, I finally understood that the only way to stop someone who doesn't respect boundaries is to stop asking them to respect boundaries and instead make the consequences of ignoring them impossible to survive. To understand how I got to that kitchen, holding that folder, you have to go back to the spring 2 years earlier, when Caleb first brought Renata home for Sunday dinner. He was 34 then, a structural engineer who had spent most of his 20s working brutal hours to build a career, and I had almost given up hope that he'd ever settle into a life that included anyone but his blueprints. So when he called me, nervous in a way I hadn't heard since he was 16, and said he wanted me to meet someone, I cried a little, out of relief more than anything else. Renata was beautiful in the kind of way that made rooms go quiet, dark hair, sharp cheekbones, a laugh that seemed designed to be noticed. She complimented my roast chicken, asked about my years teaching, told me my house felt like a home instead of a museum, and I remember thinking, foolishly, that I had gotten lucky. It wasn't until months later, after the wedding, that I started noticing the small things, the way she'd correct Caleb in front of guests and call it teasing, the way she'd mention, almost casually, how much nicer the house would look if I updated the kitchen, how much easier holidays would be if I just let her family handle the planning, since, in her words, you're getting older and shouldn't have to stress yourself. Each comment on its own was forgivable. Together, over 2 years, they formed a pattern. And patterns are the one thing I've always been good at recognizing, because grading 1,000 student essays a year teaches you to see structure even when someone else thinks they're being subtle. The real trouble started the previous Thanksgiving, the one before the one I'm telling you about now, when Renata asked, 3 days before the holiday, if her parents could come along since they'd just moved to the area and didn't know anyone yet. I said of course, because that's what you do, you open your table to family, even family you're still getting to know. Her parents turned out to be warm enough, a little loud but pleasant. What I didn't know, what I only found out that morning when the doorbell started ringing before I'd even taken the turkey out of the fridge, was that her parents had somehow expanded to include 2 aunts, 3 uncles, 6 cousins, and a family friend named Dennis, who I'm fairly certain nobody there actually knew well. 14 extra people, no warning beyond that single phone call, and I spent that Thanksgiving stretching 1 turkey and a single pan of stuffing across a dining room built for 8, smiling the whole time because Caleb looked so happy, and I didn't want to be the mother-in-law who made a scene. That night, after everyone left, I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight, looking at the wreckage of dishes and half-eaten pie, and I made a decision that would matter more than I realized at the time. I started writing things down. Dates, conversations, promises made and broken, financial requests, moments where boundaries were tested and where I had, out of politeness or exhaustion or love for my son, allowed them to be crossed. I told myself I was just processing my feelings the way I used to tell my students to journal through conflict. I didn't yet know I was building a case. The requests kept coming through that year, each one reasonable on its surface, unreasonable in its accumulation. Renata asked if she and Caleb could borrow $8,000 for a kitchen renovation on the house Caleb had bought before they married. A house that was legally his, not mine. But somehow the request always seemed to route through me, framed as helping the family. I said no to that one, gently, and Renata's warmth toward me cooled by a visible, measurable degree, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were paying close attention, which by then I was. She asked if I'd co-sign a car loan for her brother, a man I'd met exactly twice. I said no again. Each refusal was met not with anger, which I could have handled, but with a kind of performative hurt, a sigh, a comment to Caleb about how your mother doesn't think we're really family yet, the sort of manipulation that works beautifully on people who love you and terribly on people who've spent 3 decades reading essays written by teenagers trying to talk their way out of missed deadlines. I recognized the technique because I'd graded it 1,000 times. What made it dangerous wasn't Renata's manipulation itself, but the way it was slowly working on my son, who started calling me less, Started prefacing conversations with Renata thinks. Started treating my home, the home I had paid off myself after his father left when Caleb was 9, as though it existed to serve his wife's family's convenience rather than as the place I had built alone, with overtime pay and summer school classes and a lot of years without a vacation. By late summer, 7 months before that second Thanksgiving, I noticed something that changed the entire shape of what I understood to be happening. Renata mentioned, at a birthday dinner for Caleb, almost offhand, that her family was between houses right now, and that it would be so much easier if they could use my place as a gathering point for the holidays going forward, since my house was, in her words, centrally located and honestly just has better bones for hosting. I smiled and said we'd see. But something about the phrase going forward sat wrong in my stomach, the way a sentence sits wrong when a student has clearly copied it from somewhere else and doesn't fully understand what they're claiming. I started asking quiet questions, the way you do when you want information without alerting anyone that you're looking for it. I asked Caleb casually how Renata's parents were doing with their house search. He said a little too quickly that it was complicated and changed the subject. I asked one of Renata's cousins, whom I'd befriended at a family gathering, because she seemed the most honest of the bunch, what between houses actually meant, and she told me, without any idea of the weight of what she was revealing, that Renata's parents had actually sold their previous home 8 months earlier and had been living with relatives ever since, moving from house to house because, and here the cousin lowered her voice like she was sharing a secret she'd been told not to share. Money's been tight since the business thing. The business thing. I filed that phrase away like a student's suspicious footnote and kept reading. It took me 3 more months of careful, patient digging, the kind of digging you do when you're not in a hurry, because you understand that the truth doesn't disappear if you wait to find it properly, to learn what the business thing actually meant. Renata's father, it turned out, had run a small home goods import company that collapsed under a mountain of debt 18 months earlier, not from bad luck, but from what 2 former employees, whom I found through a public business licensing database and then very politely called under the guise of writing a piece on small business struggles for a friend's newsletter, described as deliberate financial mismanagement, unpaid vendor invoices, and a habit of borrowing from family members with promises of repayment that never came. Renata's family, all 40-some of them across 3 generations, had spent the last year and a half being quietly, systematically squeezed for money and shelter by 2 people who had run through their savings and their credibility in equal measure, and who had landed, eventually, on me, the mother-in-law with a paid-off house and, apparently, more patience than sense. Understanding this didn't make me angry at Renata's extended family. If anything, it made me feel something closer to grief for all of them, people caught in someone else's collapsing situation, showing up to a stranger's Thanksgiving table because they didn't know where else to go and were too embarrassed to say so out loud. But it made me furious at Renata because Renata knew. Renata had known the whole time, and instead of being honest with me, instead of saying, my family is struggling and I don't know what to do, she had chosen manipulation, guilt, and quiet colonization of my home and my son's loyalty, because it was easier than admitting the truth and asking for help like an adult. I didn't tell Caleb what I'd found, not yet. I want to be honest about why, because I've thought about this decision more than almost anything else in my life. I didn't trust that he would believe me over his wife, not because he was a bad son, but because 2 years of careful narrative building had done exactly what it was designed to do, positioned Renata as the reasonable one and me as the aging, slightly rigid mother who struggled to adapt to having new family. If I confronted Renata directly, I knew, with the certainty of someone who has watched 1,000 teenagers deploy the same tactic, that she would cry, express hurt, tell Caleb I was attacking her family during a hard time, and win the sympathy of the room before a single fact had been verified. So instead, I did what I had spent 31 years training myself to do when I suspected a student was building an argument on a foundation that wouldn't hold. I gathered documentation, quietly, thoroughly, without confrontation, until the case was airtight enough that no amount of performed hurt could talk its way around it. I pulled the public court records on the failed business, which included 2 small claims judgments against Renata's father for unpaid debts. I saved text messages from Renata, going back over a year, requesting money, requesting my home for gatherings, subtly pressuring Caleb to talk to his mother about various financial matters. I kept a written log, dated and specific, of every promise made and broken, every boundary crossed, and the exact words used to cross it. And in October, 6 weeks before that second Thanksgiving, I did the one thing that would matter more than anything else. I called a lawyer, an old friend from my church who specialized in family and property matters, and asked her a very specific question: whether a person could legally restrict or formalize the use of their own home for gatherings, even against family pressure, and what my actual financial and legal exposure was if Caleb and Renata ever tried to claim any right to my property based on years of hosting family events there. She laughed gently and told me what I already suspected, that I had every right in the world to my own house. and that the real issue wasn't legal at all. It was emotional. It was about finally being willing to enforce a boundary I'd been too afraid to enforce. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, Renata called me directly, which she rarely did, always preferring to route things through Caleb. Her voice was warm, performatively warm, the way people sound when they're about to ask for something large. She said her family had worked things out with their housing situation, was renting a place temporarily, but that it would mean so much to everyone if we could do Thanksgiving properly this year. Her family, all of them, at my house, since we had so much room and it would be the last holiday before things get easier for everyone. I asked, keeping my voice light, how many people that would actually be. She paused, just slightly, and said, oh, maybe 30, 35. Family's a big deal to us, you understand. I told her I'd think about it and get back to her, and I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the folder I'd built, thinking about the difference between generosity and exploitation, and about how the line between them isn't about the size of the request, but about whether the person asking respects your right to say no. I called Caleb the next day, and for the first time in months, I asked him to come alone without Renata for coffee. He looked tired when he arrived, the specific tiredness of a man caught between two people he loves, who are pulling in opposite directions, though he didn't yet know how far apart those directions actually were. I didn't ambush him. I didn't yell. I did what I'd always done best. I laid out the material like a lesson plan, calmly, in order, letting the facts build their own case instead of my emotions building it for me. I told him what I'd learned about his father-in-law's business, the court judgments, the pattern of borrowing and defaulting across the extended family. I showed him the text messages, not to embarrass Renata, but to show him the pattern, the steady, persistent pressure applied over 2 years, the requests routed around him and toward me because I was the softer target. I told him I loved Renata's family, that I felt for what they were going through, and that none of what I was about to say came from a place of cruelty toward people in a hard situation. And then I told him the actual plan, that this Thanksgiving I would host exactly the number of people I had originally agreed to host, 12, his immediate family and mine, and that if Renata's extended family showed up beyond that number, uninvited and unannounced, I would not be quietly absorbing the cost and chaos the way I had the year before. Caleb sat very still for a long time. Then he asked to see the court records again, read them twice, and put his head in his hands and said quietly, I didn't know it was that bad. That was the moment I understood that my son wasn't complicit, he was uninformed, which is a very different thing, and it was the moment I decided that whatever happened next, I wasn't fighting my son, I was fighting for him. We made a plan together, the two of us, at that kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat alone the year before amid the wreckage of an ambushed holiday. I would confirm to Renata, calmly and in writing, that Thanksgiving would be for 12 people, our immediate families only, and that if her extended family wished to join, they were welcome to bring their own contribution and confirm numbers with me directly, in advance, so I could plan appropriately, the way any reasonable host would ask of any guest. This wasn't a trap. It was, in fact, the most reasonable request in the world, the kind of boundary any host has the right to set, and I suspect Renata knew that, which is exactly why, when I sent the message, she didn't respond to me at all. She went around me again the way she always did, telling her extended family that the invitation stood, that Caleb's mom is just stressed, don't worry about it, come anyway. Counting, I believe, on the same dynamic that had worked the year before, that faced with 40 people already en route, I would fold rather than create a scene. What she didn't know, what nobody but Caleb and I knew, was that this time I had prepared not just a boundary but a consequence, one that didn't require raising my voice or making a single accusation in front of a crowd, because the best kind of justice I'd learned from 31 years in a classroom isn't the kind you announce, it's the kind that simply quietly lets people experience the natural result of their own choices. On the morning of Thanksgiving, I had already, 3 days earlier, informed the 12 guests I had actually invited, my sister, my brother-in-law, 2 of my closest friends, Caleb, and a handful of Caleb's cousins on my side of the family, that dinner would be small this year, and I'd asked them quietly to arrive not at the usual 4 o'clock, but at 6, after I'd had time to handle a family matter. I had also, 4 days earlier, called the venue manager of a beautiful community events hall 20 minutes from my house, a hall I had once rented for a retirement party, and reserved it for that Thanksgiving afternoon under my own name, paying the deposit myself. And I had 2 days earlier quietly arranged for a local catering company, one I trusted from years of school fundraisers, to deliver a full Thanksgiving spread, turkey sides, pies, drinks, enough for 50 people, directly to that hall at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, paid for entirely out of my own savings. A decision that cost more than I would normally spend, but that I considered, in the end, the cheapest possible price for what it would buy me. So when the doorbell started ringing that morning, when car after car pulled into my driveway and 40-some members of Renata's extended family began unloading folding chairs onto my lawn, laughing, calling out greetings, entirely unaware that anything was wrong. I opened my front door not with panic, but with the same calm, patient smile I used to give a classroom full of students who'd shown up without their homework, expecting the deadline to bend around them the way it always had before. Renata was at the front of the crowd, beaming, already directing her cousins toward the backyard as though she'd done this 100 times, which in her mind I suppose she had. I said good morning to everyone, warmly, genuinely, because none of this was their fault, and then I said, loud enough for the group to hear but calm enough that it didn't sound like a confrontation, that there had been a change of plans, that dinner this year was actually being hosted at a lovely event hall not far from here, fully catered, plenty of food and seating for everyone, and that I'd texted the address to Renata 3 days earlier so she could pass it along. I watched Renata's face change in real time, the practiced warmth flickering, replaced for just a moment by something sharper before she smoothed it back over. She said, a little too loudly, that she hadn't seen any text, that this was news to her, that surely I wasn't turning away family on Thanksgiving. I said, still calm, still smiling, that I would never turn away family, and that in fact I'd gone out of my way to make sure there was a beautiful, spacious place with plenty of food waiting for everyone, precisely because I loved them and wanted them to be comfortable, but that my own home this year was reserved for the 12 people I had personally invited, the way any host reserves their own home for their own guest list. What happened next is the part I think about most, because it's the part that revealed, finally, in front of 43 witnesses, exactly who Renata was. She could have accepted the graceful exit I'd built for her, gathered her family, driven the 20 minutes to a hall stocked with more food than they could eat, and preserved every ounce of her dignity. Instead, she turned to the crowd, to her own aunts and uncles and cousins, and said, her voice rising, that this was typical, that I had never accepted her, that I was punishing everyone because I was controlling and couldn't stand not being the center of attention. She said it in front of her parents, in front of Caleb, in front of a cousin who I happened to know had personally lent Renata's father $4,000 that was never repaid. And that was when the first crack appeared in the crowd's loyalty. Because you cannot accuse someone of being controlling while standing on their lawn with 40 uninvited relatives. And everyone standing there, even the ones who loved Renata, could see the arithmetic of that moment plainly. An older man near the back, who I later learned was one of Renata's uncles, said quietly but audibly, she did text the address. I saw it on the family group chat. And I watched Renata's face go through something close to panic, because she had in fact seen the text, had read it, and had simply chosen to override it rather than lose the audience she'd built her whole strategy around. Caleb stepped forward then, and this was the moment I had privately hoped for but never demanded of him, because I wanted him to arrive at it on his own terms. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said that his mother had planned something generous and thoughtful, that everyone was welcome and fed and comfortable at the hall, and that he thought it would be best if the family headed over there now while the food was still hot. He said it kindly, but he said it standing next to me, not next to Renata, and that single positioning told the entire crowd everything they needed to know about where this particular argument actually stood. There was a long, uncomfortable pause, the kind of silence that happens when a room, or in this case a lawn, recalculates its understanding of a situation in real time, and then, slowly, people started moving back toward their cars, murmuring directions to each other about the hall, a few of them throwing apologetic glances my way that told me they'd understood, on some level, that they'd been used as leverage in a fight that was never really about them. Renata stood on my lawn for a long moment after everyone else had started leaving, and it was just the three of us, her, me, and Caleb. And I saw something in her face shift from performance to genuine fear, the fear of someone realizing that the story she'd been telling for 2 years had just collapsed in front of the one audience whose belief she actually needed. She said my name, quieter now, and started to say something about how she'd just been trying to help her family. And I told her, honestly, that I understood that I had spent months learning exactly how much her family had been struggling, and that I felt real compassion for what they'd gone through. But I told her, too, that compassion for her family had never required deception toward me, that she could have told me the truth 18 months ago, and I would have helped in whatever way I reasonably could, the way anyone helps family in a hard season, but that instead she had chosen manipulation, had used my son's love for both of us as a lever, and had spent 2 years treating my home and my patients as infinite resources, rather than gifts that could be withdrawn. I told her that the hall was paid for, that the food was warm, and that she should go be with her family. Because whatever came next between her and Caleb, and between her and me, that was a separate conversation, one that deserved to happen without an audience. The dinner at the hall, from what I heard later, actually went well, 40-some relatives eating a full Thanksgiving meal together, grateful, if a little shaken, and more than one person told Caleb quietly that it had been the nicest gesture anyone had made for their family in a long time, which, when he told me, made something in my chest loosen that had been tight for 2 years. My own dinner, the 12 of us, was smaller and quieter than any Thanksgiving I'd hosted in a decade, and it was, without question, the most peaceful holiday I'd had since Caleb's father left. Caleb stayed close to me all evening, quieter than usual, clearly turning something over in his mind, and near the end of the night, after our other guests had gone home, he sat with me at the kitchen table, the same table, and asked to see the folder and the whole thing this time, every text, every document, every date. He read for almost an hour without speaking. When he finished, he didn't defend Renata, and he didn't attack her either. He said simply that he needed time, that he loved her, but that he needed to understand how much of what she'd told him over 2 years had been true and how much had been strategy. And I told him that was exactly the right question to be asking, and that I would support whatever he decided, because my goal had never been to end his marriage, only to stop being a resource that got extracted from without consent. What happened over the following months is, I think, the part that gives this story its real ending, because it wasn't dramatic, it was slow and honest, which is usually how real change looks. Caleb and Renata went to counseling at his insistence, and in one of those sessions, according to what Caleb told me much later, Renata finally admitted the truth about her father's business failure and the full extent of what her family had been asking of relatives for over a year. She admitted, too, that she'd been afraid that if she told the truth plainly, she'd lose her family's respect for marrying up, as she put it, into a family with a paid-off house and a mother who had her finances in order, and that the fear had curdled slowly into manipulation because manipulation had always worked for her before. I don't know if that explanation excuses what she did. I've thought about it a great deal, and I've landed somewhere that feels honest to me. Understanding why someone did something isn't the same as pretending it didn't cause harm. And Renata's fear didn't erase 2 years of my home and my son's loyalty being treated as things to be won rather than respected. But I will say this because it matters, and because I promised myself I would tell this story honestly rather than for cheap satisfaction. Renata did change in the ways that count. She started coming to me directly instead of through Caleb. She apologized once plainly without performance, standing in my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon with no audience to perform for, and told me she understood now why the hall and the boundary had been necessary, and that she was ashamed of how long she'd let her family's crisis become my problem to silently absorb. Her father's business debts were eventually settled through a structured repayment plan that Caleb, with my blessing, helped Renata's family navigate using his own financial knowledge, offered freely this time as a genuine gift rather than an extraction. The Thanksgiving after that, the third one, was smaller by choice, 16 people at my table, Renata's parents included, invited properly in advance, with a specific number confirmed 2 weeks ahead of time, exactly the way any respectful guest confirms with any host. Renata helped me cook that year, standing beside me at the counter, and at one point peeling potatoes side by side in a silence that felt easy instead of tense for the first time in 3 years. She told me she was grateful I hadn't simply cut her off after everything, that she knew plenty of mothers would have. I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't done any of it out of anger. I'd done it because 31 years of teaching had taught me that people rarely change because you yell at them. They change when the consequences of their choices become impossible to ignore, and someone gives them a graceful way to choose differently the next time. She nodded, and we kept peeling potatoes, and outside my kitchen window I could see Caleb setting up exactly 16 chairs around a table built for 8, borrowed folding chairs filling in the gaps, every single one of them accounted for, invited and welcome, which is, I've come to believe, the only kind of Thanksgiving worth having.